I am George Knapp, listening to that UFO podcast and having one hell of a good time.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to that UFO podcast. My name is Andy, and I am joined today by a returning guest on his own this time, flying solo. Among many things, he is a biochemist, an author, and was Deputy Administrator of Bigelow Aerospace Advanced Space Studies, where he led the day-to-day operations in executing the AAWSAP contract back in Skinwalker Ranch with the DIA. Welcome back to the podcast, Dr. Colm Kelleher. Colm, welcome back.
Great to see you, Andy.
Do you know what? You're one of those guests where it's very hard to nail down a good bio for you because you've got so many things attached to your name. It's like, what do you pick and what do you not? So you never want to upset anyone, do you?
No, I mean, well, my bio is pretty sort of broad, but I guess the most pertinent things about the bio would be spending 8 years as team leader and project manager on Skinwalker Ranch, reporting to Robert Bigelow, and that was between 1996, 2004, and then between 2008 and 2010, I was also reporting to Robert Bigelow under the auspices of Bigelow Aerospace Advanced Space Studies, executing the so-called AAWSAP program, the Advanced Aerospace Weapons Systems Application Program. But my background is biochemistry, molecular biology. I've done a lot of research on the bench, so I know how to set up controlled experiments, and that's one of the things about this field that we don't have the luxury in many cases of setting up controlled repeated experiments.
And you've been on the podcast before, like I mentioned, so I would encourage folks who haven't listened to those with George to go back and check them out. We're going to discuss a few different areas. We're going to touch on the book that I spoke to George about that you co-authored with James Lakatsky and George Knapp, Initial Revelations. It's now been a few months since release, and I wonder how, for you at this point, has the reception and reaction been?
I think in general, going across, well, UFO world, as George likes to call it, obviously there's a sort of a tremendous amount of disparate reactions, some of it hostile, some of it actually really positive. Also got a lot of positive reviews from people who are in the sort of the more academic settings, regarding the Initial Revelations book, because realistically, the UFO topic, is traditionally a nuts and bolts topic, and this book was fundamentally a nuts and bolts book about a nuts and bolts topic, and we did not spend much time in this particular book on the various aspects of effects of UFOs on humans, which is really sort of the great, I guess, most controversial part of the entire UFO topic. And if you take humans out of the equations and all you have is sensors picking up data, for example, like Project Hestelen in Norway has been doing that for decades, and there are multiple different examples of autonomous sensor platforms deployed in various places around North America. If that's all you have, and you have no humans at all in the equation, you can get a lot of pretty good data regarding UFO performance, acceleration and right angle turns and luminosity, and you might even be able to extrapolate to power generation. So the book that we published recently, came out I think early October, is all about the performance characteristics of UFOs. The previous book that we had published over 2 years ago, Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, was it was supposed to be a balanced book on both the effects on humans and on the characteristics and performance of UFOs. But the whole focus of Skinwalkers at the Pentagon in terms of reaction was all about the sort of the strange effects that OSAP investigated, which, by the way, were only a tiny minority of the cases that we investigated. But, you know, there was a tremendous sort of kickback and feedback on that small minority of cases that blew it out of proportion. So, you know, we think that the Initial Revelations book is basically balancing the equation. You know, you've got a sort of something very, very top heavy in terms of focus on human effects and Skinwalkers of the Pentagon. And then to balance that out, you've got a pretty sort of in-depth description of the various programs that were conducted during the OSAP period, which was 2008 to 2010, on the physics or on the UFO performance, with a view to eventually sort of getting to grips with the physics, and then further down the road, engineering. And that's always been the bottom line regarding the OSAP program.
It's interesting you say that. The Skinwalkers at the Pentagon book, like you say, did get a reaction from a vocal minority, shall we say, on social media particularly, as tends to be the case. A lot of focus on werewolves and Dinobeavers. Dinobeavers is always the big one, isn't it? And like you say, that's a small part of the book. Is that something, if you could go back and remove, you would? Or do you stand by that that's something that's worth reporting because you know what happened?
We absolutely stand by it because, you know, if you don't follow the data and accumulate the data, and you start sort of cherry picking what you want to report, versus what you want to put in the garbage, then you're on a real slippery slope. And, you know, the whole thing then becomes, it's not an exercise in science, it's an exercise in something else. So unless you have the ability to follow the data and report the data, then, you know, I think you're wasting your time, because the UFO phenomenon has been around, you know, we know from Jacques Vallée's work for around centuries. But, you know, realistically, if you look at the UFO phenomenon, a lot of people take the convenience of Kenneth Arnold's sightings in June of 1947 as being the start of this sort of engagement with global media with respect to the UFO phenomenon. That's usually taken as the start. But I mean, from then all the way through to now, there's been a lot of different attempts to study the UFO phenomenon, and, you know, a lot of people who have ignored the effects on humans, you know, end up getting a very distorted data set. And you know, people like Jacques Vallée, and you mentioned Jeffrey Kripal at the very beginning of this. I mean, Jeffrey Kripal is a very, very big proponent on reporting out the different aspects of not only effects of UFOs on humans, but also on UFO performance, because, you know, it's kind of like you've got to have the whole picture in order to start interpreting it. Otherwise, you're completely lost in a fog of sort of uncertainty.
For any folks listening, Jeffrey Kripal, I've just interviewed, I mean, behind the scenes, recorded this several hours ago with Jeffrey. This is coming out a few weeks after, as with Jeff's. But yeah, Jeff was a very interesting conversation looking at the history, the religion, how that ties in together, those conversations, and very much that you mentioned piecing bits of the puzzle together in that bigger picture. That right. He says it's right now, that's still a very fuzzy picture, and no one really knows truly what this is. You look at Skinwalkers at the Pentagon. The headline grabbers from that, right or wrong, was the kind of Dinobeaver stuff, werewolves. Some of us found some of the cases very, very interesting. Obviously, there was the intelligence officer who had the orb pass through his shoulders and come out the other side. A lot of really interesting effects talked about. The nuts and bolts element of this book, Initial Revelations, the headline grabber, no doubt, was James Lukatsky, and his Chapter 9 mention of the US government having a retrieved non-human craft that they were able to open up and go inside it after some problems. Is that something you thought when you put that in there, that'll be the thing people take away from this? Are you surprised at that?
Yes, we were not surprised, but the reason that that particular description went in there is because if you look through the sort of the archives of UFOs, you see you see various sort of snippets of information that do sort of pertain to a very intensive high level program that the United States government has been involved with for decades. And I'm talking about sort of testimony from people like going all the way back to sort of Robert Sarbarker, Wilbur Smith, General Arthur Exon, back when who gave out snippets of information regarding these sort of recovered material from these objects. And then there's a lot of the New York Times did a really interesting article by Eric Davis, in which Eric Davis was featured. And then we had the David Grush testimony on Capitol Hill there during I think it was July of this
Yeah.
year. Um, and then, one of the people in the article describing David Grush is Carl Nell, who is also, a very sort of strong proponent in terms of backing David Grush up. So you've got these sort of data points that are all saying the same thing. And, the Lukatsky revelation, if you want to use that word, is another data point in a pretty large tapestry that is internally consistent. So, I mean, people will see that as another data point. We keep hearing, and we actually do know that a lot of people have testified to various committees, both the Senate Armed Services Committee and congressional committees on this topic. So there will be more information coming out of the future. So from the perspective of this book, we felt, and Jim Lukatsky also felt, that it was definitely, plausible and consistent to add another data point into this collection that is sort of evolving into a tapestry that, as I said, is pretty internally consistent.
The conversations we're starting to hear now, you mentioned David Grush, the number reported is 40 plus other whistleblowers have come forward, like you say, to speak to various committees under oath, classified settings and whatnot. Are those types of conversations being had, and what James Lukatsky's mentioning, recovered craft being retrieved and opened up? Were you exposed to those kind of conversations back in your AAWSAP days? And is that stuff that's coming out now that you're very much either not surprised about or you expect it to come out?
I'm not surprised. I was exposed to multiple conversations of that ilk back in during the AAWSAP days and after the AAWSAP program. But as part of the TSSCI clearances, I did sign documentation not to give out any details. And I think George mentioned to me that he had talked a lot to you about this whole idea of the DOPSR organization that will essentially draw a line in the sand over what is published. And if you try to go beyond what is published under the auspices of DOPSR, then, sometimes action can be taken. So, there's a great reluctance on the part of myself and Jim Lukatsky and others not to go beyond these lines. But also, I think Lukatsky felt that providing that data point as part of this multitude of data points that are starting to emerge is a very worthwhile exercise because it is supportive, it is corroborative, and, it is going down that same path that is all leading to the same, endpoint. Whether or not that endpoint actually happens is really up in the air. But there's a lot of data that is coming forward that is very consistent, and it's coming from different people, different sources. So usually when you triangulate that sort of information, that all sort of is consistent, then that provides a stronger, basis on which to form interpretations.
I appreciate and respect, and I've said ad nauseum on the podcast, and listeners will know this. If someone signed an NDA or has some kind of top secret clearance, there are very good reasons why they don't just come out and tell everyone for the good of the UFO community, who on Twitter or Instagram or whatever it might be, might demand Colm Kelleher comes out and gives us all the juicy details that he knows, and to hell with it. He can go to jail, but he can hold his head high, and his family can miss him from a distance, essentially. I know that tends to be the common thing, but I wonder, have you been approached to either testify yourself, or would you testify yourself if asked?
The answer to all of the above is yes, but it would really depend on what is the context, and also what is the environment. Right now, I don't see the environment as being particularly permissive. I know for a fact, I've talked to people who have testified, both to the various congressional committees, Senate and Congress, as well as AARO. And the question there is, what is being done with that information? How effective is that information being followed up? Or is the information is just kind of put in a drawer somewhere, and sort of people have this sort of version of, to use that oft-quoted phrase, ontological shock. This is something I don't want to deal with. This is something that is going to affect my career if I sort of move this forward. And so there's a lot of hesitancy, I think, in terms of receiving that information, because there are no clear guidelines. There's a lot of sort of confusion right now on Capitol Hill regarding even a simple process like getting a briefing in a skiff. I mean, that's a very, very simple process, but it's being rendered incredibly complex because there's so much confusion about, do these people have a need to know? What is the reason for briefing various Congress people on these kinds of topics, and what is going to be done with that information? So I think there's a lot of confusion, and I would look at, clearing up some of that confusion before sort of going ahead, because I know for an absolute fact that a lot of people have gone and over quite a period of time have testified, and that information is just sort of in a vacuum now. I mean, it's nothing really concrete is being done with it. And in terms of follow-up, there's a difference between following something up with a sense of purpose versus going through the motions. And various people we know have given enormous amount of detail, both on Capitol Hill and also briefing to AARO. And there's enough detail to actually follow up. And following up doesn't just kind of mean just making a phone call and accepting what that other person on the phone gives you, and then, okay, well, case closed.
I think that's an interesting point, because many people, common perception is that as long as a whistleblower circumvents AARO and goes round to some other committee, then that's a great thing. But like you say, there's no surefire thing that they're going to follow it up in a meaningful way. And you're quite right that as we record this, I'll just say it's the 2nd of December. The UAP Disclosure Act is very much up in the air. Politicians getting involved in this subject is something many folks have wanted for some time, but I think it's just muddied the waters even more, and we're seeing more of that compartmentalisation and lack of understanding of government coming out on a daily basis, and that's just not even just on social media. Are you surprised that's happening?
Well, no, I'm not surprised, because I think the sort of regulations about the national security requirements, unless you go through the whole process and you've got the proper briefings, tend to be very confusing. And this whole concept of need to know, which is a sort of an entry point in terms of briefing, into various programs, some of which are, highly classified. Need to know is a very strong indicator of whether or not somebody is actually going to get a briefing. And, if there's a perception that there is no need to know in briefing Congressperson X or Congresswoman Y, that's not going to happen. And those people are going to get very frustrated. But the national security structure and apparatus has been in place for decades, and it's not a mystery. But, people seem to think that they can walk into a skiff and get briefed on waived, unacknowledged special access programs. I personally think there's a lot of theater going on right now on Capitol Hill. And, there's whether or not that actually will produce any actionable information is another thing. But I'm pretty skeptical. I think there's been sort of the beginnings of a pushback from within the intelligence community regarding this sort of, okay, let's go into a skiff and brief all these Congress people. I mean, that's not going to happen realistically. And if it does happen, it's probably not going to be a particularly comprehensive briefing.
What impact do books like Skinwalkers at the Pentagon and Initial Revelations, and even books that are currently undergoing review, like Lou Elizondo's book, which is much anticipated, what kind of impact can that have on this whole process that's going on just now?
Well, we've had, for example, really good feedback from back channel from people associated with AARO, for example, many of whom have read both Skinwalkers at the Pentagon and also Initial Revelations. And, the feedback has been very positive that, there's, if you look at sort of page 10 or 11 on on Initial Revelations, you'll see a table of sort of where there's various things defined, like, whether or not the AARO had a science plan, and whether AAWSAP had a science plan. Did it have the capacity for field investigations? Does it have comprehensive the ability to put together a comprehensive database? There are sort of 10 separate criteria in this table in our book, in which the AARO sort of basics are compared pretty precisely with the AAWSAP program procedures and logistics. And, there's over a 90% overlap between the AARO punch list and the AAWSAP punch list. So, I think people at AARO read these books, and they, I think they appreciated that AAWSAP was actually a really good template for the formation of a UFO program. I guess the biggest sort of difference between AAWSAP and the AARO programs would be AAWSAP did have an overt arm that was looking into consciousness studies and what that actually entailed. There were sort of small pilot programs on remote viewing, for example. We're not aware of anything comparable at AARO, for example. So there are small discrepancies like that. But in general, I think that the overlap between AARO punch list that we know and the AAWSAP punch list are very, very similar. And I guess the biggest difference between what AARO has available to it is the long range data and classified sensors. AAWSAP were looking to acquire that capability, but the program was shut down after 27 months, and that capability never manifested. But it was definitely on the wish list of AAWSAP. It is on the execution phase of AARO, so they do have access to long range radar and classified sensor data, and that's a very useful characteristic to have. And also both programs were focused on this question whether or not UFOs constitute a threat to national security? Do they have threat? Is there threat potential in the UFO topic?
You talked about previously information going to the right channels, but the way it was handled, rendering that information meaningless or that testimony meaningless. Is it fair to say that's the way AARO has been perceived under the guise of Sean Kirkpatrick? Because there's not been many folks been particularly positive about how their information has been handled and indeed what's been done with it.
Yeah, I've heard the same dissatisfaction that you're just describing from people who have testified to AARO, and it may be just a case of people sitting on this information until there's a sort of a window of opportunity to pursue it. But we do know that briefings have been given to AARO months and months and months ago, and there has been absolutely no follow up or follow through, even sort of processing the information that was given. It's been very, very slow. So we've heard the same information as what you're describing.
It sounds to me like getting a 10-part tell-all with Christopher Mellon, and could be the most revelatory podcast in the history of UFOs, but I don't release it, so that's all very well. I've heard the information, but it goes nowhere, so no one else finds it out, and that's been the frustration. We've got a changing of the guard at AARO, and hopefully there can still be some kind of impact, but that's an organisation that's left a bad taste in the mouths of a lot of folks. I'd love to know, though, you mentioned obviously the headline grabbers in the book and the purpose of the book. Is there anything you feel that's gone under the radar with initial revelations that you feel people either haven't picked up on or you thought would be more of a talking point?
Well, I think the main sort of purpose, or the sort of the front and center part of initial revelations, is all about Project Physics. And Project Physics was this attempt on the part of AAWSAP to solicit information from a lot of the subject matter experts that are out there on things like lift, propulsion, advanced propulsion topics, even going as far as sort of faster than light travel. So the idea of Project Physics was to project out 40 years from 2008, 2009. So projecting out and getting the best and the brightest to put this into a series of white papers that would be sort of tremendous use to various arms of the government in terms of planning future. But secondarily, it would form this incredibly comprehensive baseline of what future technology would look like in the aerospace sector. And then it would be able to match it against the UFO performance. So, hopefully the intent was for the delta between the UFO performance as being reported all over the map to the AAWSAP program versus what these projections of advanced aerospace technology would look like 40 years in the future. And I guess, some of the feedback that we've got so far is that the Project Physics papers are sort of they're being dismissed, they're being derided, they're being sort of essentially ignored. I guess that part has surprised me, because we deliberately put this book together in order to sort of give out comprehensive layperson summaries of the 38 white papers that were delivered to AAWSAP, which AAWSAP in turn delivered to the Defense Intelligence Agency. The Defense Intelligence Agency in turn put those up onto JWICS, onto a very, very sort of accessible part of JWICS where, organizations such as DARPA that are into advanced technology, or other parts of the Pentagon, all the way through various intelligence agencies, United States Air Force, United States Navy, all of these organizations had access to those papers. And the feedback when these were on the classified network was tremendously positive. The feedback, in contrast, once these went public and they're now on the Defense Intelligence Agency website, the feedback was exactly the opposite. It was very negative, and a lot of hostility, a lot of dismissive. This stuff is all just sort of vanilla, bogus, sort of dreaming up stuff. But actually, the technical parts of the 38 papers were very well received behind closed doors. But the purpose of the book was to basically create a series of easily understandable summaries of these papers to make the argument that the project physics was actually a very useful exercise in reducing what we all know as the large gap between what we know and what we can do in terms of engineering and physics versus what we observe with the characteristics of UFO performance.
Why do you think that disparity of the initial reception to the public perception?
It's something that I guess it goes back to what George Knapp would call UFO world, the whole sort of Twitterverse and the Reddit community. There's a tendency to sort of engage in one-upmanship in terms of being the most hostile or the most sort of dismissive. And I think it's kind of it's a self-licking ice cream, really. I mean, it's just a sort of an exercise.
I like that. I like that. Yeah. I like that phrase. I'm going to use that in the future. A self-licking ice cream. Okay. It's like that's the new self-fulfilling prophecy. I like it. Do you think some of that could be to do with, not rightly or wrongly here at all, Colm, but who releases the information? I.e., if Chris Mellon releases something and you release something and Jeremy Corbell releases something and Lou Elizondo releases something, there can be 4 different reactions just because of who released it?
I think that's a fair point, yeah. All the way back in 2017, before the New York Times broke the article, I think there was a lot of discussion because some of the people that were involved in the initial releases were aware that what AAWSAP did was, in terms of following the data, did lead down some controversial paths. And so, yeah, I mean, there has been a sort of a protection on the path on the part of a lot of different people who were involved in releasing that information to be very careful about what kinds of information were released. So, I can see that the source of the information and how it's released plays a great part in stimulating various frenzies on Twitter and Reddit and all social media in general.
Yeah. Question I want to ask you that I did ask George when I spoke to him recently, and he said, speak to Colm, was pretty much word for word. So on the James Iandoli podcast, Engaging the Phenomenon, I highly recommend folks go and check that out. You were on that with George, and you discussed perception management during experiences or sightings. You mentioned that many witnesses had seen a light at Skinwalker Ridge, and that those with advanced night vision binoculars could make out various shapes, and those differed from person to person. One hypothesis mentioned was that the people were meant to see different shapes. And is there anything to suggest that the reason people see different things from the same experiences could potentially be to do with the people themselves?
That's absolutely a possibility. We know that eyewitness testimony in general is colored by expectations and conditioning and all of that. So, but there's also this idea that the UFO phenomenon also can influence different eyewitness perceptions. I know that Jacques Vallée and others have actually written extensively about this whole thing. And we thought that the incident on Skinwalker Ranch was a good example of that. But, there are other possibilities for sure. And, there's a sort of a membrane between what people actually see versus what they expect to see, and there's a lot of room for manipulation within that whole thing. That is very easy to, if you're looking at manipulating, there's a lot that the human perception gives you in terms of ease of manipulation. And Jacques Vallée has sort of written extensively about this whole thing where two people they come upon a UFO on the side of the road, and one person walks away with a memory of a car crash, and the other person walks away with a memory of a UFO on the side of the road. Other people have reported the same thing, where there are dramatically different versions of realities, quote unquote, reported by two people who are in the same car looking at ostensibly the same thing. And that's an example of what we would call perception, manipulation of perception. But like you say, human psychology is tremendously complex, and going all the way up there. It really depends. I think there's a sort of a continuum that can be influenced.
I know in my own sighting I've talked about, I was 10, 11, 12 years old. There was 5 of us saw an object, and it wasn't up in the sky. It was, I've said before, Colm, it's like a Ferris wheel on its side, but at a kind of 30, 40 degree angle, spinning incredibly fast, lots of lights, and it was in a very built up area in Glasgow when I was younger. Hundreds of people would have seen it, given it was in a very suburban area. The other 4 folks who I was with, including my mum, if I ask them now what was it they saw, they remember seeing something, but none of them can remember what it was. I remember very clearly what I saw, and it always stuck with me. And I always find that curious that given it was something so spectacular, the other 4 who don't have an interest in the subject whatsoever just remember seeing something, and that was it.
Yeah, I think that's a very good example of, I think, what we're talking about is it gets very, very blurred, especially when whatever this is outside outside anything that people have seen before. I mean, the consciousness tends to try to fill in the blanks and sort of join a whole bunch of dots that sometimes are inappropriate to join.
Yeah. I'd love to just get your thoughts on a few listener questions as we kind of head on to the last part here, Colm. A question from Luigi, which is sort of just on what we're talking about here. At the Rice presentation, you were showing a few interesting slides, and Luigi asked, could you expand a bit more on the mimicry aspects of the UFO phenomenon as they pertain, for example, the witnesses of the Man in Black, black helicopters, and triangular UAP?
Yeah, that's going back to the Rice University. Was part of the Jeffrey Kripal's the Archives of the Impossible conference that happened. I think it was May of this year, or April maybe. But yeah, I think the slide tried to summarize what some of us call the bidirectional mimicry hypothesis, and that is that the UFO phenomenon in general has probably at least 2 levels of deception associated with it. And the first level of deception would be deception from the United States government that is tasked with essentially deception and concealment of programs that pertain to UFOs. I mean, that's part of their job is to create deception, concealment, and distractions. So we had a very interesting conversation with kind of the maestro of deception and concealment, the head of Air Force Office of Special Investigations, Colonel Barry Hennessy. We interviewed him in a cafe outside the Pentagon for about 4 hours. And, the purpose of our interview was to talk about some of these so-called Northern Tier sightings. And that was the set of sightings that were all over the Air Force bases that go right across the 49th parallel that have to do with all of the missile launch facilities on this side of the border with Canada that are ready to respond to incoming Soviet and now Russian missiles coming over the North Pole. So all of these missile bases, Air Force bases, were in a high state of readiness, and during the 70s and 80s, there was a lot of reports of intrusions by UFOs, unidentified flying objects, onto these Air Force bases. And so we point blank asked Barry Hennessy what was going on there. And he told us, 50% of what was documented in these sightings were ours, and 50% we had no idea of. But the point is, Barry Hennessy was at pains to explain that the UFO phenomenon was a very convenient cover under which to hide a lot of advanced technology programs, advanced, special access programs that were advanced technology that the Air Force did not want the public to know about. So anytime something was flying, for example, there's a famous case in northern New Mexico in which one of these prototypes crashed. There was a lot of a lot of rumor and innuendo about a crashed UFO in the area that was put out deliberately in order to conceal the fact that this was an advanced prototype from a special access program that the United States Air Force was running. That's an example of the sort of level of deception that the United States government routinely perpetrates on the United States public. It's part of their job. It's part of the Air Force Office of Special Investigations job to deceive and conceal and all of that. So that's one level of the deception. The second level is during the NIDS program, the National Institute for Discovery Science program, back between 1996 and 2004, NIDS was in the middle of this, what can only be called a UFO wave of these black triangle sightings. And that was these low-flying, football field size, silent, extremely brightly lit objects that would, routinely fly over crowded neighborhoods, fly down interstate highways at extraordinarily low altitudes. I mean, when I say low altitude, I'm not talking about 1,000 feet. I'm talking about treetop level, 60 feet, 70 feet, 100 feet. I mean, ridiculously dangerous. And we started investigating those things. And the first thing we thought of was these are obviously Air Force programs. And we investigated the first 10 under that auspices. But by the time we reached 100 separate cases that we had investigated all over the United States that were essentially identical, the same thing was happening all the time. Extremely low, extremely brightly lit, very large, very silent. And, talk about air safety violations. Those pilots we postulated had to be on some really heavy drugs or something to warrant these violations. Eventually, the data became so overwhelming that one of the hypotheses we put out was that this phenomenon was actually mimicking Air Force special access programs. So, there's a level of deception being perpetrated by the phenomenon. So the bidirectional mimicry hypothesis is basically that there are two levels of deception. Every time a UFO, within reason, every time a UFO phenomenon or event is being investigated, you're looking at that event through two separate lenses of deception. And so, from a scientific perspective, I don't know of any other scientific sort of discipline where you've got to go through two levels of deception before you actually start doing an experiment. I mean, trying to do a controlled experiment when, there are two different actors trying to actively conceal and deceive regarding the data that you're trying to examine. I mean, that is the reason why there's been very little, I guess, progress made in UFO in general in the UFO field, going back multiple decades.
It's an interesting answer. Thank you, Luigi. I know, Luigi, you sent in several questions, but just time for the one. A question from Newman, and Newman asks, was AAWSAP able to give any attempt at explanations for the peculiar forms of motion that have been observed by UAPs, specifically the zigzag movement of the tic-tac and the commonly reported wobbling or fallen leaves motions that disc-shaped craft are reported to perform?
Well, that was part of the agenda for OSAP, and I've said this on many occasions before. Is that the 27 months of OSAP was a truncated time frame. The program originally was going to go 5 years plus, and a lot of the people who were involved in setting up the program were hoping it would go somewhere between 5 to 10 years. And at that stage, a lot of these questions could have been answered. But the whole idea of starting from scratch, getting top secret clearance facilities orchestrated, hiring 50 people, full-time people, getting those 50 people security clearances, and then going into the training process, and then deploying all of these people out in the field, boots on the ground all over North America to collect data, and then databasing all of that data. I mean, that's where we ran into the limitations of where time was not on our side. By the end of the 27-month program, I think OSAP was a really well-oiled machine. But in terms of getting the database completely populated, that was a real success story. But the next part of doing that would be to analyze what's in the database. And we never got down to the nuts and bolts analysis because we ran out of time. The program was shut down after 27 months of operation. So, Newman has a very good question, but we were not able to join those dots because we ran out of time.
Adrian asks, if Colm and his co-authors had written initial revelations 3 years ago, would they have been cleared to publish it? And if not, who's responsible for the muzzle coming off now?
I believe if we had written initial revelations 3 years ago, I think it would have been mostly accepted through DOPSR, because I think DOPSR really focuses through a pretty narrow lens, and that is whether or not the information in a particular book is violating national security regulations and is actually reporting out aspects of sources and methods or aspects of classified programs. If that is the case, DOPSR will drop the hammer and will remove stuff. I mean, in Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, for example, we submitted Skinwalkers at the Pentagon to DOPSR, and they took out a lot of particular details about people's names, offices, particular locations, people who were serving active duty, military. They insisted we change all of that stuff to protect the information. But I think the simple answer to your question would be what we actually put out in initial revelations, probably the majority would have been accepted 3 years ago.
And I suppose some kind of a follow-up from Aaron. Aaron asks, at what point would seeing evidence not compromise national security? For example, the biological evidence doesn't reveal any tech that big aerospace or government doesn't want us to see, and it would validate much of the conspiracy.
Well, that's arguable. Biological tissue, especially biological tissue of unknown origin, may have unknown infectious entities associated with it, which itself would be extremely classified. If there were, I'm just pulling an example out of the air here, but if there were sort of viruses or other infectious entities associated with biological tissue, a lot of that data would have to be very, very carefully scrutinized over a long period of time. before it would be released to the public, because again, it would have national security implications, especially depending on the level of infectiousness. That's just one example, in terms of there is a lot of intellectual property associated with biological analysis. I mean, there are multiple law firms all around the world that are making extraordinary amounts of money defending United States patents and global patents based on biological attributes.
Last couple of questions from Tree of Life. There are purportedly many hotspots like Skinwalker Ranch, yet they have not been studied with scientific rigour. In what ways could a comparative study between sites be useful, and is the barrier to studying more sites purely financial?
I think that's a very good question. I know that during the National Institute for Discovery Science, we did attempt to go beyond Skinwalker Ranch. We moved into an area on the Icarilla Apache Reservation in Dulce, New Mexico, that happened to have a lot of very similar activity that was happening on Skinwalker Ranch. And that area was near Mount Archuleta in northern New Mexico. We found a tremendous correlation between quote unquote nuts and bolts UFO activity, unusual creatures, a lot of so-called paranormal effects were reported. We also, with the help of Captain Keith Wolverton, studied another hotspot that happened to be adjacent to Great Falls, Montana, Maelstrom Air Force Base, that had a tremendous level of nuts and bolts UFOs that were actually intruding over the airspace of Maelstrom Air Force Base, while all of the small villages that were around Maelstrom Air Force Base also had everything from Bigfoot sightings to cattle mutilations to paranormal effects, all of these strange creatures being seen. I mean, it was like, to quote George Knapp's expression, a paranormal Disneyland up around Great Falls, Montana. Same thing. So there are some of the hotspots. We spent some time in San Luis Valley in Colorado. I know Chris O'Brien has written several really good books on the absolute plethora of disparate phenomena that happen in San Luis Valley. I don't know if you're familiar with Stan Gordon, who's done a tremendous amount of investigation of the same kind of thing, UFO activity in parallel with a lot of creature activity, creature sightings in Pennsylvania. So dotted around the United States and in Europe, there are multiple different examples of these hotspots. Even in the UK, the so-called Rendlesham Forest cases, we spent some time investigating, some of the witnesses, and we were told that area around Rendlesham Forest had a long legacy of not only UFO activity, but a lot of weird, haunting-like activity. There was a famous ghost, quote unquote, that used to walk down one of the runways, in RAF Bentwaters. But so the correlations are very strong, but it's a question, I think, as your questioner said, it's a lot of resources that have to be deployed in order to closely investigate those. I mean, Skinwalker Ranch is unique because beginning in 1994 all the way to 2023, there have been intensive research programs located on a 500-acre property. That's pretty unique. The only sort of comparable area would be either Project Hestilin in Norway, which is mostly autonomous surveillance, or the area in Pennsylvania that Stan Gordon has been investigating for close to 60 years.
Final question to sum up then and let you go, Colm, because I know you're a busy man. It's actually one of Luigi's, but I'm going to give him it because I would have asked very similar anyway. Do you have a release schedule for your next books, and is Project Consciousness going to be included?
Very good question. Well, I know that Jim Lukatsky is sort of the front and center in terms of looking at that in terms of schedule, but we do have an interest in reporting out on getting deeper into Project Consciousness in the future. Whether or not it's going to be the next book that comes from Jim Lukatsky and our collaboration, or further down the road, but fundamentally, there's a very, very strong relationship between the UFO phenomenon and human consciousness. And, eventually that has to be really front and center of the next UFO program. And we would argue strongly, again, based on the book Initial Revelations, we would argue strongly that the AAWSAP template that is already shown to be a success is a very viable template for future UFO programs, including Project Consciousness, which, obviously will not be the first project that would be kicked off in a new UFO program, but it could be down the road.
That is all for this week's show. Thank you very much for listening. Please remember to leave the podcast a review on your chosen platform. You can like, retweet and subscribe. That would all be very much appreciated. The shows are being uploaded onto YouTube as we speak more and more. You can sign up at patreon.com/That UFO podcast to access the shows ad-free as well. Please get in touch on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, That UFO podcast. Of course, on Twitter, it's at UFO UAPAM. And again, folks, as always, keep looking up. You never know what you might see.
It wasn't a tic-tac and not quite a saucer, more like a hubcap designed by Chaucer, a little baroque and quite steampunk, like Alice was playing bass for the Parliament of Folk. The little fucker hovered right outside of my window, and when I shoved out the screen, he made it an issue. I don't think he expected me to see his ass, but I'd had some champagne and smoked a little around. Meditative game of state full on meta. I can't imagine how it could have been any better. I got to the top of the stairs and there he was. Like, you awake? I was about to abduct you, cuz. I jumped back and nearly kissed myself, and I climbed out the window after the elf, and I woke up in my bed and there was something on my head and everything was weird and everything was red. I called out to my boys, they thought this was noise, they thought it was a dream, they thought it was my toys, they thought it was my problems, and they think I should seek therapy, and I don't know what it is because it doesn't really scare me. If you really want to know who I think I'd be, I guess you and me and us and we and him and her and that and she and that thing over there and what's that, Jake? But for being serious, open your mind, consider your heart, consider time, consider your space, consider your lies, consider your life, consider your eyes. It wasn't a tic-tac and not quite a saucer. It wasn't a tic-tac and not quite a saucer.